Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Welcome to this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and I am so glad to be here with you today. This is a solo episode, and this episode is coming out the week before Christmas. So if you're listening this week in real time, Merry Christmas. I hope that you have a really wonderful time celebrating and enjoying time with family this weekend. All right, now my last solo episode was quite a while ago. It was episode 176, and it was about disagreement. And I told you at that time that my next solo episode would be about how to gain a new perspective about disagreement. Well, I lied. Okay, not really, but today is a solo episode, and I am not going to be talking about disagreement. I decided to just hold off on that one. It's a heavy topic, and I think I would rather wait until next year to share that with you. So today, what I wanted to do in this episode is just share a few reflections about what I have learned in 2021, some of the lessons that God has been teaching me. You know, we talk a lot about the fact that leaders are learners here on the podcast. And I thought, you know what? I don't get to share super often on what I'm learning and what God is teaching me. And so I thought I would go ahead and take this time today to share with you 5 lessons I have been learning this year. And I'm also going to end with just 5 books that I have read that I would recommend to you. So I hope that you will stick around with me for this full conversation. Okay, so before we dive in, I want to let you know that this podcast, this episode, is brought to you by my upLIFT Mentormind. upLIFT is a program that I designed exclusively for Christian women who are building a business online and who are ready to thrive, streamline their marketing, and hit their financial goals. Most of the members of my upLIFT group come in when they have started to create consistent income, but they really want to get their business to a place of thriving. They want to be loving the work they're doing, and they want to have a marketing strategy that works and that aligns to their current needs and brings in new clients consistently. And this is what we do in the program. So the program is open to join at any time now. And so you can head over to the website about it, upliftmentormind.com, and go ahead and just find out more about it, click apply. And after that, I will be in touch. So you can also send me a DM on Instagram. I'm always happy just to chat. If you want to send me a voice message on Instagram and just kind of ask me questions or, find out if it might be a fit for you, go ahead and do that. I would love to connect. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the 5 leadership lessons that I have learned in 2021. And this is in no particular order. And if you hear some sounds in the background, my dog is hanging around with me here in my office. And I'm also in the middle of an office sort of overhaul. And so I have completely moved stuff around. I'm hoping that the audio is going to be okay for this episode. Okay, so let's dive in. And this is going to be the lessons that I'm learning. And I'm calling them leadership lessons, but really they are kind of like life lessons. They apply no matter what role of leadership you're in or what stage of life. I think that these will be lessons that may encourage you as well. Lesson number 1, this is in no particular order, by the way. Surrender is an ongoing process. So back when I started this podcast, I did an episode all about the idea of leading with confidence. And that was episode number 6. If you haven't listened to that, I would encourage you to go back and listen to it. Although I promise you the audio is probably not that good, but either way, I still love the content that is in that episode. And to summarize it, I'm just going to give you a brief summary of what I talked about. I talked about the idea of leading with confidence and what that means to me. And this is the 3 points that it boils down to. Leading with confidence involves accepting the love of God that He has for you and then pouring that love into others. Point 2, accepting that God made you on purpose, so you should live your life with purpose. And point 3, accepting the leadership of Christ and then leading others that God has placed in your sphere of influence. And so I also created this graphic that shows you each of these points and how on one side of the graphic it's surrender and on the other side there's action. And the acceptance side is about the surrender. So accepting the love of God, accepting that He made you on purpose, accepting the leadership of Christ in your life. Those are all really attitudes of surrender. Turning this over to God and saying, I am not in control of this. I accept this from you. And then the other side is really the action-oriented side, loving others, living out your purpose, leading others. And so for me, this whole idea of surrender has been a long journey. And it started really when I started digging into this idea of leading with confidence. I started understanding that in order to be an effective leader, I actually had to first surrender myself fully to God and to accept His love and to just be okay with who He has made me to be, with accepting how He has designed me. And that's all about surrender. It's surrendering what we think we want, what we think we should have been, created to do, or any of those things. And so leadership truly starts with surrender. Again, I don't think you can be an effective leader without surrendering yourself to God first. So surrender means you're giving up your right to be in control or to be in charge. Instead, you're putting yourself under the leadership of God. But there's also this ongoing aspect of surrender, right? It's not like 3 years ago when I started the podcast, or almost 4 years ago, when I started the podcast, that I just decided to surrender and then that was it. No, it's an ongoing thing, because if you're anything like me, you might try to continually take control back. You may still struggle with certain areas of your life that you're trying to control. So for me, those areas, and I'm going to be super vulnerable here, areas that I often try to control are, my family, my marriage and my parenting, my finances, and situations at church, in our church body, in our church leadership. There's times that I have certain ideas about how I think it should go. And so 2021 has been a year of continuing to be reminded of my need to surrender those areas and other areas to God, to let go of my need for control and to embrace the adventure that comes when God is leading. One of the analogies that came to me recently when I was thinking about this idea of surrender and letting go of control is the concept of a roller coaster ride. So maybe you have gone on a roller coaster ride before. Probably you have at some point. And you've gotten into the roller coaster and you've gotten buckled up and the handlebar has come down over your legs and you start going on this roller coaster. And as it progresses, you decide you want to try and control where it's going. And so you grip the handlebars and you're trying to almost try and stop yourself from going too fast, or you're trying to sort of lessen the impact of the curves and the ups and the downs, right? And you're squeezing so tightly onto that handlebar that when you get off the ride, you can barely feel your fingers. But no matter how hard you try to control that roller coaster, you can't stop it. You can't slow it down. You can't change where it's headed, right? And that is kind of like life. As much as we try to control and to direct, ultimately, we are not in control. And I think that we have learned that more in the past year and a half than ever before. that we really can't control what happens. Now, we still have responsibility for our own actions, for our own behaviors, for our responses to things, right? But if you think about life as a roller coaster ride, it's a lot more fun if you do this. If you get in the ride, you get buckled up, you have all the safety things in place, but you really just embrace the adventure of the ride. So when you're going down that big drop, you throw your hands up in the air and you scream as loud as you can, and you just have fun. That's how I like to ride roller coasters. I know that if you're listening to this, if you're anything like my daughter, you hate roller coaster rides and you don't even like this example that I'm using. But I hope you get the idea of what I'm saying here is that it's a lot more enjoyable in life, just like it is in a roller coaster, if you stop trying to control everything. And if you surrender to the adventure of what's to come. So for me, this is something I'm learning and continue to learn, to just let go and enjoy the ride instead of attempting to control everything that's happening around me. All right, lesson number 2, there's almost always something going on in someone's life that you don't see. Now, some of these lessons that I'm sharing are ones that I have actually known in my head for a long time, but God keeps reminding me and showing me things. And so it's clearly an important lesson for me to be reminded of. So often, I think we look at someone's life from the outside and we see them on Instagram, or we see their posts on Facebook, or we interact with them at church and we just look at their life and we think, wow, their life is incredible. Their leadership is thriving. Their job is they are killing it at their job or in their business. But then if you actually spend the time to get to know the person and you have a conversation with them, you find out things that you didn't know were going on. You find out maybe about a battle that they're fighting that you never would have seen on the outside. For some, the battles that they're fighting are very public. And sometimes we do know about things that people are facing. We do know when someone has a life-threatening illness, or when there's been a death in the family, or when there's just some very obvious external challenge that someone is facing. But so many times the things that are going on in someone's life are internal, or they're keeping them private. They're not posting about it on social. And maybe they are just posting the good stuff because that's all they can handle talking about publicly right now. You know, I kind of get annoyed when we talk about this issue of people only posting the highlight reels on social media, because honestly, sometimes that's all someone can muster the gumption to do. Because if they post about that internal struggle or challenge they're having, they could fall apart, or they could have people that are critical of what they're feeling or experiencing. So just let's hold judgment on the whole issue of posting the highlight reel, okay? Because again, when you find out, when you get to know someone, you may discover what's truly going on. They might have a friend who has just walked away from a lifelong relationship with them. Maybe they are dealing with a marriage problem, or they have a family member who is struggling with addiction or depression. There's so many things that we don't see from the outside. And each time I get to have a real conversation with somebody and I kind of get to dig a little bit deeper on what's going on in their life, I find out sometimes something that they were struggling with that I never would have guessed from the outside. So I just want us to be remembering that. And for me, this helps me to have more compassion and more empathy for the people that I am interacting with, whether it's at the grocery store, or whether it's in the parking lot, or whether it's with my clients, or, people in my Facebook group. There's just so many different places where we might see something that somebody does and be really irritated by it. But if we really knew what was going on in the inside, we might have a little more compassion. One of the conversations we've had recently kind of alludes to this, and it was our conversation with Bonnie Gray. She said this: loneliness is just a human condition. Doesn't matter what color you are, we're all lonely. And so that was a reminder that yes, there are times when loneliness feels like, your situation feels like you're the only person dealing with that particular situation, and you might be. But the issue of loneliness, the issue of grief, the issue of hurt and sadness, it's a human issue. It's not a one person issue. So keep that in mind the next time you see someone do something or say something that bothers you. Remember that they might actually be struggling with something that you don't know about. So God is reminding me that as a leader and as a Christian, it's vital to step back and ask questions and stay curious instead of jumping to judgment. All right, lesson number 3, stories are powerful. I attended the Write Your Story workshop recently with Donald Miller and Allie Fallon in November in Nashville. And I sat there in a room with about 50 other people, and only one of them I knew before I went to the event. But part of what happened during those 2 days together is that I got to hear bits and pieces of people's stories. And sometimes someone would stand up and share just maybe 1 or 2 minutes of their story, a little brief sliver into their life. And I found that as I listened, some of the stories brought me to tears. Some of them caused me to feel shock or anger. And sometimes I would be laughing and filled with joy. Stories are powerful, and they have the power to be used for evil or for good. As leaders, we need to learn how to use our stories in our life and our leadership. Because people relate to stories so much more than they like being told what to do, right? They relate to personal experiences and the emotions that come with that. I think we're wired for story. I think that's why when you read the Bible, it's a story, right? God gave us this book full of incredible stories that are, full of ups and downs, full of drama, full of sometimes comedy. There's so much in the Bible that is story. It's not just a book full of rules and regulations. So as leaders, let's look at how can we be using stories. For me, I often want to communicate a point or get someone to understand my perspective. And my tendency is just to be like, hey, here's the thing that you need to know. And this is why it's important. So just do it, and that's the natural tendency that I have. But God is reminding me and teaching me how to use stories more in the way that I communicate and in the way that I lead. Lesson number 4, space and thinking time is necessary. So my husband and my best friend have a lot in common. One of the things they have in common is that they love to start the morning slowly. In particular, they love to have coffee and sit wherever they want to sit and just stare out the window, stare into space, just sit there. It's kind of this running joke that we have. And for a long time, I did not understand this. I enjoy my coffee in the morning, but usually I am doing something like reading my Bible or journaling or, kind of drinking my coffee and listening to my audio Bible and getting ready for the day. And so I'm generally not sitting and staring out the window. But throughout this year and back in 2022, when we really had to slow down, I started to learn and see the value, even more than I had before, of how valuable time and space is. Like empty time and empty space to think and sit and not have an agenda or a to-do list. And for many of us, that is very difficult to do. But I am learning that the more responsibility you have, this becomes more and more important. If you are only ever working in the day-to-day of your work or your leadership, you are not able to make those bigger, more strategic and significant decisions that will move you or your organization or your business, your family forward. So again, for someone who enjoys getting stuff done, this can be incredibly challenging. But I really want to encourage you to set up time in your schedule for space, for thinking time, For me, what I have to do is I have to get out of my normal routine a lot of times to really do this effectively. So when I can get out into nature, when I can go for a walk with my dog, or go out for a hike, or go to the ocean, that helps me to have that space. It's like physical space, but it's also something about being outside and being in nature really kind of opens up the way my mind works and the way my mind can think more clearly or more creatively. And this also helps me when I travel. I find that when I travel, space and time away from my normal routine helps me to sometimes have new ideas or energy that I don't have when I'm in my day-to-day work. So sometimes we need different amounts of space based on the season of life we're in as well, or the goals that we have. So again, for me, as I'm looking forward to the next year, I know that there are some specific things that I am wanting to accomplish in the next year. And they are going to require more creative thinking, more brain power. And so I have had to make some decisions that will allow for that. And they haven't been easy decisions, but they have been decisions that are going to give me more margin and more space in my schedule so that I can have that energy to put into those projects. So this is my fourth lesson. Having time for space and thinking time is a good thing. Okay. Last lesson I want to share with you is relationships can be built virtually, but community is solidified when you're face to face. All right. Now I know this might be somewhat controversial because some people are all about, we've got to be face to face all the time. And other people are like, well, let's just do everything virtually. It all can be done virtually. I'm kind of in the middle because I really love doing things virtually. I love working at home and I love being able to sit here and podcast and get this done in my office at home. And so much of what I do is virtual. I work with my clients and my students virtually. I have friendships that I have built that started in Facebook groups online. I never met them for 2 or 3 years until, we finally had the chance to be in person together. And so I believe that a lot can be done in relationships on a virtual basis. But I also believe, and it's been solidified this year, that when you can be in real life, in face-to-face situations, that will help to solidify the bond and the connection that you have in those relationships and in your community. So this year, for us with our church, we've been meeting in person again. We've hosted a small group in our house. I attended the Clarity to Courage conference in October, and then I went to 2 other events that were in person. And I have just seen the value of those connections and those conversations and being able to look someone in the eyes and have the laughter and have the tears. There's something different about it. And so for me, it's been a game changer to get to have this time and this connection in person. So this is just a lesson that I've learned, and it's something that now I am really looking at how can I make sure that I prioritize being in person with others, even though it may not be possible all the time. It takes intentionality. I think it was in an episode I did with Holly recently where I said, something about like, pick up the phone, call the friend, be intentional. Because if you don't, it's just not going to happen. It's not going to magically happen that you are going to have a group of women at your house for brunch. It's not going to magically happen that you're going to be hosting a small group and connecting with people. You're going to have to be intentional. And so for me, again, I am going to be more committed to investing in real life, in-person connections, even more so than I have in the past year and a half. Now, again, I know that for some people, there may be limitations to that for health reasons and other issues, but this is just something that I am seeing. I don't think we're meant to just do everything virtually. I do think that God has wired us in a way that there's something that happens when you're in a room with someone else that doesn't happen necessarily when you're virtual. So that's my take. That's my last lesson I wanted to share. And I hope that that was just a little fun adventure talking through my year and some of the things that God has been teaching me this year. Now, I want to wrap up sharing really quickly 5 books that I would recommend that you check out if you haven't done so. And again, these are not necessarily leadership books, but I think that they would be helpful for you in your leadership. And some of them have been mentioned here on this podcast by some of our guests. So the first book that I read, not the first book that I read this year, but one of the books I read this year that I highly recommend is called Christians in the Age of Outrage by Ed Stetzer. And he really talks through the tendency for us as Christians to respond with outrage to all sorts of issues in our culture around us, and how that, and it's actually the response of our culture too, this whole issue of outrage and shock and awe around what's going on around us. This is a common thing. But we as Christians, we don't have to respond that way. We can respond differently. And so he walks us through examples as well as how we can respond differently to what's happening in the world around us. So I highly recommend that book. Another book that I read this year is called Storyworthy by Matthew Dix. This is not a faith-based book, so I'm just going to preface with that. But it is a great book if you want to improve in storytelling. So since I mentioned the issue of stories in this episode, I thought I would mention this book. It is so good at helping you learn how to craft a story and how to tell a story. He is just a very funny guy, tells a lot of hilarious stories, but a lot of them are just things that have happened in his life. And he helps you to figure out how to find the right stories to tell. And again, how to actually tell them so that they're not going to bore someone and make them want to stop listening. Okay. Another book that I recommend taking a listen to or reading is Fear is Not the Boss of You by Jennifer Allwood. And this is a book that really is going to motivate you and give you a kick in the pants. If you need to get out of your head, if you need to push past fear, if there are things that God is calling you to do, then this is a great book. And Jennifer she tells great stories. She's funny. She's relatable. And I have the pleasure of being in one of her programs right now. So I love hearing about what she has going on. But it was really fun to read her book and hear her voice. I listened to it on Audible. Highly recommend that if you are an Audible listener. Actually, all of these books that I'm sharing, I have listened to on Audible. So that's how I consume most of my books. Okay, the next book I want to mention is Tactics by Greg Koukl. Now, Tactics is really valuable. I actually think every single Christian needs to read this book and have it on hand, because what it does is it helps you figure out how to have conversations about faith. So in our world, in particular in North America, in the United States and Canada, we are living in a post-modern and post-Christian culture. Whether you like it or not, many people, and I would venture to say the majority of people in our culture, are not really that interested in God. And they may or may not think it even matters what you believe. They may think that everybody can just believe whatever they want and it doesn't matter. And so for us to learn how to have conversations about faith is essential, and Tactics will help you to learn how to do that. Okay, the last book I want to mention is Essentialism, and this is by Greg McKeown. And technically, I read this a couple years ago, but it is one that I consistently recommend, and I need to re-listen to it again because it's really all about honing in on what is most essential in your life. So if you're multi-passionate, if you love doing lots of things, if you have lots of ideas, if you want to pursue all of them all at the same time, then Essentialism will really help you to make decisions and to get clear on what is most important in your life. So recommend that one. All right, friend, thank you so much for being here with me on this episode. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. I do want to mention that if you go over to the show notes for this episode, I will have the links for those books I mentioned and anything else that I talked about. So you can just click on over to those links. I do have affiliate links for Amazon. So that just helps support the podcast. If you happen to click through my link, it just gives a little bit of benefit to the podcast to help cover the cost of what we do here. So next week, Holly and I are going to be back with you, and we're going to share a little bit about the state of the podcast. And we're going to talk about what it's going to look like moving forward. So make sure that you're following so you don't miss out on the updates that we are going to share with you. Now, as a reminder, if you want to hear more about working with me inside of my upLIFT Mentormind, if you are a Christian who is building a business online and you want to be able to up-level where you're at, if you want to be able to have really strategic marketing that aligns with your goals and be doing work you love, then I would invite you to come on over to upliftmentormind.com and check it out and apply, or just send me a DM on Instagram and touch base and let me know you're curious about the program. All right, friend, thank you for being here today in this episode. Now go on and have a wonderful Christmas weekend. I hope you have a blast celebrating, and let's remember to celebrate the biggest gift of all that we've ever received, and that is Jesus. I will talk to you next week. Thanks for joining us on the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, would you consider leaving us a rating and review in your podcast app? This helps more women just like you find the podcast, and it also helps them to know whether the podcast would be a good fit for them. Just go to the show in your podcast app, then scroll down until you see the option for ratings and reviews. From there, you can tap to rate and write a review. It means the world to us when you take a couple minutes to do this, and thank you so much to everyone who has left a review. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.